A lot's going on in Alberta these days, especially in the aftermath of the federal election, all this talk of separatism and a referendum. But of course, we just had a spring session of the Alberta Legislature wrap up with some consequential bills, many unanswered questions still regarding major scandals swirling around the government. And plus, we're still waiting for the Premier to call some by elections, including one that will feature our next guest. Naheed Nenshi is leader of the Alberta New Democrats. Mr. Nenshi, great to have you with us here today. Welcome to the program.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Rob. And yeah, it's a tumultuous time. There's a lot going on
Indeed.
in politics at a time where I think a lot of people would prefer just to stop thinking about politics for a while.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let me ask you about the by-elections. I guess there's three now that the premier needs to call, but you've been waiting for a very long time. The clock is starting to run out here on the premier's obligation to call these by-elections. What are you hearing, first of all?
Well, it's just such petty politics. Rob, I've been the nominated candidate in Edmonton Strathcona for about 4 months now. The UCP has had a nominated candidate for months as well. And they're just being petty. They're not even trying to hide it. They didn't want me in the spring sitting of the legislature. That's over now. But the latest I've heard is that they're now thinking, if we wait another couple of weeks, then the Edmonton by election will be during the Calgary Stampede, and then
Wow.
Naheed won't be able to be there during the Stampede. That's sort of the level of pettiness of this government. And they did it before. When we had a by election in Lethbridge West, they waited almost the full amount of time and they deliberately called that by election on the last day of final exams at the university in the hopes that the students would be too busy to vote. And it's just the kind of tricks they play. Compare that to the prime minister saying he'll call a by election to let Pierre Poilievre into the House of Commons as soon as possible. That's just
Yeah.
sort of how government is done. But that's not how these folks work. And so it is pretty challenging. It's pretty irritating. And most important, it's left the people of Edmonton Strathcona and now Edmonton Ellerslie and soon Olds Didsbury Three Hills without a representative for a really long time, which just sort of shows the contempt that this government feels for actual citizens wanting to have actual representation. Let's not forget that Danielle Smith herself refused to run in a vacant seat in Calgary Elbow, left that riding open for almost 9 months because she knew she would be difficult for her to win there. Then she finally convinced one of her people to step aside in return for a government job to run her in a very safe seat. Yeah, it's just bad politics as far as I'm concerned. But, the people of Edmonton Strathcona are waiting, and I'm happy to represent them should I get that opportunity.
So, as mentioned, you were forced to watch the spring session of the legislature from the sidelines. But talk about what you observed, both in terms of, first of all, what the government was bringing forwards in legislation, but also the manner in which they pushed a lot of these bills through.
It was a very strange session. It was only my second session because obviously they tried to keep me out in the first session too um, of the legislature. And it was characterized by a whole bunch of things. Number one is, as you alluded to, the entire thing was under the cloud of scandal. And question period was largely just about the scandal. Which they, refused to actually call a public inquiry on, which is the easiest and only way out of it for them for now. They rammed through a whole bunch of legislation, but surprisingly, very little that actually addresses things that are important to Albertans. Nothing on the cost of living, nothing on the economy, on jobs, nothing on education at all, nothing on healthcare until the very, very, very end. And what you're alluding to is right at the end, without telling anybody, they put through a series of 3 or 4 bills that they didn't run on. No Albertan wants or voted for any of these things. And they rammed them through with no debate at the very end of the legislature, midnight sittings, the whole thing. And those were sort of a trio. There were 4 pretty objectionable bills. 3 of them, a trio of them, really are dismantling the democratic system that we have. One on municipal government, one on school boards, and one on provincial governments, basically allowing probably what the UCP thinks of as an unlimited pool of dark money flowing into themselves and candidates they support municipally. It's really bad. And, I'm someone who's been working on campaign finance reform and taking big money out of politics since long before I was in politics. And they just, without consultation, without telling anybody, brought back in union and corporate donations, increased the limits, allowed for political action committees, allowed individual candidates to have their own bank accounts so that their constituency association doesn't control the money, so that if they lose the nomination, the constituency association doesn't get the money. For municipal and school board folks, they've removed the ability for governments to have their own codes of conduct. So basically, municipal politicians and school board trustees now have no code of conduct that they have to live by, and they've removed the ability for cities and school boards to put them in. And they said very clearly that was because a school board trustee they kind of liked was removed in Red Deer, and so they want to remove the opportunity for anybody to remove school board trustees or municipal politicians who act badly. And then their final bill was a bill about healthcare, which, if you recall way back when, Rob, Ralph Klein tried to pull in Bill 11 that was about privatization. There was a huge consultation. People hated it, and he pulled it back. Well, Bill 55 actually puts in place an entirely private healthcare system by regulation, by whim of the minister, of the premier and her ministers, and there was zero debate about it. I don't think any Albertan even knows that happened. So, tomorrow the Foothills Hospital could be given to a private corporation to run, according to this bill. And they managed to do all of this kind of under the cover of darkness and in a way that's just about enhancing their own power, not doing what's right for Albertans. So if you're waiting for a surgery, or you're worried about your job, or your kid wants to get into university, or you have a child with disabilities in an overcrowded classroom, literally nothing they did this session will help you in any way.
We did see a cabinet shuffle just right at the end of this session, and I think two of the ministers you've identified as being close to this scandal, McAmery and Justice, Adriana LaGrange in healthcare. Even though some of the positions have changed, they're more or less still in the same positions here. So those two in particular. But what did you make of the cabinet shuffle?
Well, it's a cliche, but I just want to say, Premier, the ship is sinking, and shuffling the chairs is not going to help. So I disagree with your characterization of Adriana LaGrange. She got a massive demotion. So we now no longer have a health minister. We have 4 health ministers.
Yeah.
There's no longer a Department of Health. There's no one coordinating the healthcare system. But Adriana LaGrange is one of the 4, but she now no longer has any oversight over Alberta Health Services. She no longer is involved in these alleged bloated contracts, these shady contracts to UCP insiders for surgeries that have led to increased wait times and more money out of the public purse. She's no longer involved in that. She's in charge of primary care and prevention. So primary care is about family doctors, but after sitting on the deal for almost a year, she signed the deal with the family doctors. So now she'll be free to mess around with naturopaths and homeopaths and whatever she wants for primary care. But the particularly ironic thing is she's now in charge of prevention. This is a woman who could not say, get your kids vaccinated against measles. She has actually muzzled the public health department when she was Minister of Health, and now she's in charge of prevention. So I guess all of us will be boiling a bunch of dandelion roots and trying to stay healthy as best we can. The most shocking thing about the shuffle, though, is she didn't move Mickey Amery. So Mickey Amery is the Minister of Justice. He stood up every single day in session to defend the government against this corrupt care scandal, this healthcare scandal, which isn't just healthcare, by the way. It's in infrastructure, it's in public safety. It appears to have gotten its tendrils throughout. And he did not disclose that he happens to be the cousin, his wife's cousin, of the guy at the center of the scandal, one Sam Marash. Turns out it's the Justice Minister's cousin. This is the same guy who invited multiple cabinet ministers to hockey games. The Justice Minister said at the very end, oh, he's actually a close personal friend, and I've been to multiple hockey games with him. I just didn't think I had to tell anybody that. And the minister didn't disclose it. He didn't say he was in a conflict of interest. At that time, Marshall Smith, the Premier's chief of staff, was renting a house from the same family. So they were his landlord in the mansion he lived in. They were the Justice Minister's relatives and close personal friends. They're getting hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. And allegedly, the CEO of AHS, when she pointed all of this out, was fired for her troubles, for being a whistleblower. This is bad. And, just the Minister of Justice being the cousin, that alone is a scandal that should take down a government. And it's just yet another step in this entire thing. It's pretty shocking. And the fact that the premier chose to leave him in as Minister of Justice just shows that she doesn't care. She thinks that she is immune to any criticism and she can just do whatever she wants, and is sort of above any standards that traditionally we would expect politicians to adhere to.
Well, I mean, the re-election of the Liberal government federally, I think, has given the premier sort of a convenient target or scapegoat, and she'd much rather talk about the federal government than her own. But in a way, too, this is kind of almost getting outside of her control as we now see this push for a separatism referendum. And you mentioned Bill 54. We got some changes coming in terms of how much money might go into this, how easy it is to prompt a referendum in the first place. So yeah, it feels really volatile and unpredictable right now in Alberta. What do you make of everything now that's going on here?
Well, I mean, it's very clear that the premier is desperately trying to change the channel from her own government's record. But here's the thing, she's succeeded. We're all talking about separatism now because we have to, because there will almost, barring court action, there will almost certainly be a separatism referendum next summer. And the way you characterized it, Rob, I think is exactly right, which is she's lit a fuse on a bomb she cannot control. So, if you want to look back a few years, I happened to be in the room by coincidence when David Cameron made a speech, the former Prime Minister of the UK, made a speech to a bunch of very important elected officials and very important business people in the world, announcing that he was going to have a referendum on leaving the European Union, the Brexit referendum. And I remember very well in that speech, he said, I don't support this, and Britons will never support this. We're never going to vote for it, but it gives us leverage to get a better deal with the European Union. And what he didn't say out loud, but everyone in the room knew, is the only reason he was doing this was because he was scared of the UK Independence Party eating into his base. And he thought that this would shut them up and bring them back into the Conservative fold. Does this sound very familiar? Mm-hmm. And so now we have the premier who finally, after months, brings herself to say, I don't support separatism, but, and then she's got a big long list of buts. And so she knows what happened to David Cameron. She knows what happened to Jason Kenney, if you want a more recent example. You'll recall that when Premier Kenney was finishing off his term, he said, quote, the lunatics are taking over the asylum, unquote. And I remember telling him at the time, I said, hey, Premier, if you're the arsonist, if you're the one who lit the match, you waive the right to call the fire department. And this is precisely the path that Danielle Smith and her team are going down. So really, there's only one of three things here. Either she thinks that she can outsmart everyone else. She's smarter than Jason Kenney. She's smarter than David Cameron, and she can outsmart them. Or she actually is not aware of the crisis that she's causing, how she's putting the very nation at risk right now in a very serious way, because she takes us all for fools, and maybe she herself is taking herself for a fool. She keeps saying, I'm not doing this. The people are doing this. Right. We're not that stupid. You changed the legislation to enable this to happen. You went to a UCP meeting with a guy who's in charge of the Alberta Prosperity Project and praised the work he was doing. You think people don't notice that? You don't think, Premier, people don't think that you're actually doing this on purpose? We know you are. So either she thinks she's too smart, or she herself is so dumb she doesn't know what she's doing, or she just likes to watch the world burn. In any case, what she has caused here at a time when the very aspect of Canadian sovereignty is under threat from outside is causing us to look weak, causing us to be divided against one another, and creating a situation much like Quebec in the 70s and 80s. And by the way, she praises that. She says, yeah, well, Quebec got great deals from Canada as a result. Well, Montreal also used to be the main financial center of North America. And as soon as all this started, the U-Hauls down the 401 to Toronto started. Canadian Pacific moved its headquarters from Montreal to Calgary. Is that what she wants for Alberta? That kind of business uncertainty? When the president of ATCO, one of the most strident conservative supporters in the province, says that she's pausing her investments in Alberta until Danielle Smith gets her head on straight for separatism. When Dow Chemical pauses the only construction mega project we've got, this is a very real economic threat. And I'm not saying Albertans don't have legitimate concerns. We have very legitimate concerns. But this isn't going to fix it. And it's going to cause economic ruin and social disorder like we've never seen before. And either the premier doesn't know, she thinks she can outsmart us, or she doesn't care.
Well, and I mean, there's the question as to whether she's setting some of this up to fail and what she's put forward to Mark Carney. I think there's an opportunity for moving forward on some issues, building a better relationship. As you say, I think
Yeah, of
there are
course.
legitimate concerns that Alberta has, but is there a genuine desire to make improvements there? Or is it just about using this for political reasons?
No, she doesn't want to win. That's the funniest thing about this government. I've been a student of politics my whole life. I've been in public life, as you know, for 15 years, alongside with you in this world, right? And
Mhm.
I've never seen a government like this, a government that has no interest in actually governing. They just are interested in scoring political points. And, I jokingly said that she spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on endorsing Pierre Poilievre in the last federal election. But I think that those should have been listed as donations in kind to the Liberals, because every time she opened her mouth, she helped Mark Carney look better. And I thought that's so weird. But
Yeah.
then I realized actually she's doing it on purpose, because she doesn't have someone to fight in Ottawa, and she doesn't have anyone to fight at home. She's already fighting vulnerable people, unions, workers, you name it, in Alberta. She's just built for the fight. She'd rather fight than win. And as I say, in my world, we don't pick fights, we win them. And I'll point out that the UCP has been in power for 6 years. They have not entertained one proposal to build 1 mile of pipelines. They haven't moved that file forward in any way. Who got a pipeline built? The NDP government, the federal government, and the mayor of Calgary at the time. But she's not interested in winning. Like, the latest thing is she says, you must give us the pipeline. You must give us the Northern Gateway pipeline to Prince Rupert. Here's the thing. The Northern Gateway pipeline didn't go to Prince Rupert. It went to Kitimat. That's nowhere near Prince Rupert. She doesn't even know her own file. And she is actually pushing for something that's been proven to be unsafe and impossible. And is she doing that because she wants to lose, or because she doesn't know what she's doing? Either way, I think Albertans deserve better.
I did want to touch on this too, and you alluded to it. The Alberta NDP and their position on pipelines is a contrast to the federal NDP, where over the years there's been some disagreement, even some tension. We saw in the recent federal campaign a bit of a divide, maybe some provincial NDP members supporting the Liberals, others supporting the NDP, or maybe even other parties. Is there more of a gap now, or division between the Alberta NDP and the federal NDP? Where do things stand?
Well, so let me be clear about this. The Alberta NDP has always been financially independent of the federal party. We've always been completely independent by way of policy. However, our practice had been until 2 weeks ago that if you joined the provincial party, you were also a member of the federal party. And our convention 2 weeks ago, we severed that tie. So in reality, we are quite independent of one another. In fact, I barely spend any time thinking about or talking about the federal party. And right now, they don't have a leader. They've got 7 seats, so they're in a rebuilding phase right now. But look at me. I was the mayor of Calgary for 11 years. You don't get to be the mayor of Calgary unless you understand the energy sector really well. And I went around the world. I remember sitting down with President Obama's chief domestic policy advisor at one point to try and make a case for the Keystone XL pipeline. I would make speeches in French in Quebec on the importance of the Energy East pipeline. I always joke that TransCanada had a video of me on the front page of their employee intranet for months, because they wanted all their employees to watch it, because they said nobody makes the case for pipelines like this guy does. And so I'm still the same guy. I fought hard for the Trans Mountain expansion, and I believe the Trans Mountain expansion is the one thing that is keeping our energy industry afloat in the face of Trump tariffs. The Trump tariffs, which, by the way, the premier called a big win for Alberta. We're in a very serious existential crisis, and we need to ensure that we have access to ports, access to markets outside the United States to prop up the price of our main commodity. Now, is this going to solve our economy forever? Of course it isn't.
Right.
We all know that at some point that product is going to lose value. At some point there won't be demand for Alberta oil and gas. But that's a good long time from now. And in the meantime, for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, we need to maximize the value of what we've been given and build the economy. And by the way, save the money. so that when the oil and gas is gone or there's no market for it, we have money in order to operate our budget. But right now, the government of Alberta is more reliant on royalties than they were before. They have presided over a massive fiscal turnaround from a $5 billion surplus to a $6 billion deficit in 1 year. Even in the absence of Trump tariffs, they would have seen a huge deficit this year. With the oil price being what it is now, I'll be surprised if we get out with less than a $12 to $15 billion deficit. It would be even more if not for the Trans Mountain expansion, reducing the differential between WTI and Western Canada Select. So at least our royalties have a little bit of a floor to them. But the government doesn't seem to be interested in getting this right. Sure, they'll yammer on about pipelines, but they're not really interested in supporting the growth of the industry. And let's remember that even with all of the damage that the industry has taken over the last 10 or 15 years, we still have record oil production in this province.
Yeah.
And we need to ensure that that continues as long as it can continue, but that we work with industry and partner with them on figuring out how to deal with the energy transition instead of pretending it's not happening or using transition as a dirty word. You know, I sat down with some of the top leaders of some of the largest oil companies in Calgary in the fall, and I'll never forget what someone in the C-suite at one of the largest companies in the country said to me. He said, "This government irritates us because there is no more room at the grown-up table for climate change deniers. And their constant denial of the transition is getting in our way of communicating with our shareholders and trying to make the changes we need to do to make sure that the last barrel of oil burnt in the country, in the world, is a good Alberta barrel of oil." This government is acting as an anchor on our ability to change. And frankly, that is what they are. They mouth a bunch of slogans and platitudes, but they're not working with the industry to make it successful in the long term.
Well, we'll leave it there for now. Naheed Nenshi, I guess we'll wait for the word on the upcoming by-elections and see what else the coming weeks and months bring us here in Alberta. But do appreciate you making some time for us here today and appreciate your perspective on all of this.
Well, thanks so much, Rob. And the very last thing I'll say is, look, I'm a very proud Albertan and I'm a very proud Canadian, as are most Albertans. And it really is time for us to stand up for our country. We can't let the loud voices who want to split us apart take over. And I'm going to be spending a lot of time this summer talking to Albertans about that.
All right. Naheed Nenshi, thanks again.
Thank you.